This is a Sicha from Likkutei Sichos, from the Sichos in English collection translation of the Sicha. So the Rebbe will begin with number 1. The Yom Tov of Pesach, the festival of Pesach, is known by 3 names, each one describing a different dimension of the Yom Tov. A, in the Torah Shebeksav, in Chumash, in the written Torah, it's called Chag HaMatzos, the festival of Matzos. Beis, in our davening and our prayers, we refer to it, in addition to the Chag HaMatzos, as Zman Cheruseinu, the season of our freedom. C, our Chachamim, and this is also common parlance, in other words, how people refer to it when they talk about the Yom Tov, refer to all 7, and in the diaspora, in 8 days of the Yom Tov, as Chag HaPesach, the festival of Pesach. It could be said that the central point and fundamental theme of the Yom Tov finds expression in the 3 names mentioned. Not only is it found, in other words, in the expression in the 3 names, but also since the order of concepts mentioned in the Torah is also a Torah teaching, meaning the order, the Seder in Torah, constitutes a lesson ha'irah for us. It follows that the 3 names of Pesach and their respective themes are mentioned in the order of their importance. First comes the concept of the festival of Matzos, the name given by the written Torah. Then comes the concept of Zman Cheruseinu, the season of our freedom, the name coined by our sages, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, to be used in davening. And then Yom Tov of Pesach, Chag HaPesach, the accepted name used by our Chachamim and also in common parlance. Section 2, the Navi Yecheskel describes the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, as the birth of the Jewish people. The reason he uses the analogy of birth is not only because at that time the Jewish people became a nation, that would also apply with regards to other people who attained nationhood. It wouldn't be something unique to the Jewish people. But in this case, why does the Navi refer to it as a birth? Because of something unique in the process over here. But because by becoming a nation, the Jews also were transformed into an entirely new entity, which they weren't before. The goal, intent, and consummation of Yetzias Mitzrayim was not simply releasing the Yidden from bondage, but bringing them to Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. For this reason, when Hashem first promised Moshe that he would liberate the people, he told him, when you take the people out of Egypt, you will serve Hashem on this mountain. So we see that the purpose and the entire mission of going out of Mitzrayim, and one continuation of it is, the entire continuation is about serving Hashem at Har Sinai, receiving the Torah. This is also one of the explanations why the celebration of the Yom Tov of Shavuos, the Zman Matan Tereseinu, the season of the giving of our Torah, is determined by counting 7 weeks from the day after the first day of Pesach. No Yom Tov is determined by what its relationship is to a previous Yom Tov. Here, Shavuos is determined how many weeks it comes after Pesach, because this shows that Shavuos, the season of the giving of the Torah, Matan Torah, is a continuation of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, the birth of the Jewish people. In other words, the birth of the Jewish people is connected with their becoming a Torah nation. In other words, it's not just reaching nationhood that other nations have, but we have a completely different process because through this, we became a Torah people. What defines our people as a whole, and every Jew individually, that their entire nature and existence is the Torah. That's what occurred starting from Yetzias Mitzrayim and concluding with the giving of the Torah. The giving of the Torah brought about a new state of being within the Jewish people. Not only because they were initially, beforehand, in an extremely low spiritual state while they were in Golus and Mitzrayim and exile in Egypt. And as a matter of course, they were, when looking at their own inherent spiritual state, not fit kalim, receptacles for the Torah. That is certainly true. He's not denying that fact, because having fallen into the 49th gate of impurity while in Mitzrayim in Egypt, their spiritual state was the very opposite of the Torah and holiness. But that's not the entirety of the idea how Yidden became an entirely new being. However, irrespective of the previous spiritual state, the primary reason the giving of the Torah, Matan Torah, brought about a total metamorphosis within the Jewish people was because of the nature of the Torah. It transcends humanity, no matter how lowly or lofty. So in other words, it's not about because we had to leave our low state, but the very state of Torah is beyond humanity. We have to transcend our humanity entirely. The Torah is described as a beloved infant close to him, his delight every day, shashuim yom yom. It is a cherished treasure that was concealed by Hashem. This is all psukim and shir hashirim describing the Torah. In other words, something that transcends created beings entirely. Torah is completely out of this world. Torah is completely beyond the ken of human beings. As such, for the Jews, as they exist in this material world, and certainly as they existed in Mitzrayim in Egypt, it was a total novelty, something beyond their frame of reference. Accordingly, the three names, Chag HaMatzos, Zman Chiruseinu, and Chag Pesach, express specifically in that order, like we said before, the order matters, the three motifs that are necessary to bring about the transformation of an existing entity, which the Jewish people were before receiving the Torah, into a new entity of an incomparably loftier nature, that they were now a Torah nation. Section 3. The nature of these three stages can be better understood via an analogy of the process through which a teacher conveys a new concept to a student, a Rav and a Talmud in the terminology of Chassidus, one that the student could not conceive of on his own. In other words, it's completely beyond the level of the student. We're not talking about just information that the teacher is sharing that with enough research the student would have been able to know on his own. We're talking about communicating something completely beyond him. The concept would be new to him, not only because he had not heard it before, but because it transcends his intellectual frame of reference. The teacher is conveying to him something that would otherwise be entirely beyond his grasp. The first thing that is required of the student to begin the process of appreciating this new idea is an approach of bittul, self-nullification. What makes us say this, that to be able to approach a completely novel and new idea, you need to have bittul? This is indicated by Chachamim's statement: when a Torah scholar sits before his teacher, his lips must drip myrrh. Myrrh, a fragrant resin, shares its root letters with mar, bitterness. A student sitting before his teacher must feel bitterness stemming from dread. What does that mean? He must feel utterly humbled in the presence of a person whose understanding entirely transcends his own. So the Rebbe is going to explain why is that necessary, why is that a prerequisite before the student can begin to accept and receive the idea from his teacher. Since this new concept transcends his frame of reference, the student cannot grasp it with his own power and mind, like we mentioned before. It's not just he was lacking the information, it was just something that's totally beyond him. Instead, it is specifically bittul, which bittul means going beyond his own existence. That is a medium to make this possible. When a person leaves their existence, then they are able to accept and receive something that's beyond them. To borrow a phrase from our Chachamim, an empty vessel, klei reikon, machzik, can hold because the very emptiness of it allows it to hold. So the same thing, the person's bittul, the student's bittul, makes him a vessel that can hold the idea that the teacher wants to impart to him. That's step number one. Step number 2, afterwards, the student must try to internalize the concept. This requires using his own mind, meaning involving himself and his powers. In other words, together with the approach of bittul, being an empty vessel that holds kli reikon machzik, like the Chachamim say, he must nevertheless be a kli, and more precisely, a perfect kli, a perfect vessel without any damage that nullifies its functionality. Therefore, the approach of bittul is not sufficient. The student must apply himself to grasping the idea, endeavoring to become a kli, an entity that receives and holds. So that's step number 2, to actually take in the ideas that he is being taught. First step is the bittul, making himself a kli, and then to receive those ideas. The purpose of, and then there is a higher third level. The purpose of the learning process is that the student ultimately attain the understanding of his master. It says, Koyim inish adaiti de rabbi. Therefore, from the outset, the student must be conscious of the objective. True, in his present state, he is not yet on a level on which he can appreciate the understanding of his teacher, of his Rav. For that reason, the teacher must convey to the student a contracted version of the concept, what's called a mitzumtzum, tzimtzum lashon chassidus, one that the student's mind can grasp, while the depth of the idea, how the teacher perceives it, is merely contained in a hidden manner in that contracted version. So step number 2 of this process, after the bittul, which is step number 1, is that the student receives only a contracted version, a constricted, a limited version of the idea. But in that limited version is concealed the teacher's own understanding. And therefore, nevertheless, the student must be directed to the ultimate goal. From the outset, the student's approach must be characterized by the desire to go beyond the borders and limits of his own mind and elevate his understanding to that of the teacher. It is specifically through such an approach that ultimately he will attain the understanding of his master, which is an entirely loftier plane. That is stage number 3. Parenthetically, the Rebbe is now going to say in section 4 that seemingly this order, beginning with bittul, it seems to be a problem. The bittul beginning seems to contradict something else that we have learned. Once the Rebbe is going to address that issue, he's going to, after that, in 4 and 5, he's going to explain back to our topic, bring it back to the idea of the 3 names of Pesach. 4, on the surface, this process, that first comes bitterness and dread, the approach of bittul, and afterwards the progression to becoming a kli, an entity fashioned by the instruction of the teacher, that's the order, appears questionable. The Gemara, the Talmud states that before Rabbah began instructing the rabbis, he made a humorous remark, which Chassidus says, milsa de bdichase, and the rabbis laughed. Afterwards, he sat in awe and began the lesson. From Rabbah's conduct, we see that when trying to teach a new concept to a student, the pattern is that a teacher must open the hearts of the students before beginning his instruction. This enables each of them to become a fit kli to understand the lesson. Only afterwards did the Rabbah sit in awe with fear and bittul. And we said that there has to be the fear and bittul as the first step. And here we see that the first step is not that. This does not contradict the need for a student to adopt an approach of bittul at the outset, as mentioned previously. Making a humorous remark before beginning to instruct the rabbis was merely a general preparation for the process of study as a whole. So the answer the Rebbe gives is that what Rabbah made a humorous remark was not part of the teaching itself. It wasn't part of the lesson and the process of study. It was an introduction beforehand. However, it was not part of the study itself, meaning it was not a stage in the transmission of the lesson. In other words, Rabbah did not intend to make his listeners fit kalim to accept his teaching by making a humorous remark. That wasn't the purpose of the Milsa de B'dichasa that Rabbah said. His goal with that Milsa de B'dichasa was to create within them a desire to become recipients, meaning to establish a channel of communication, to establish a rapport, so that their minds would adopt a mode of acceptance that would motivate them to reach beyond the present frame of reference. So the humorous remark was a preface. It's not even part of the process of learning. That bittul is part of it. However, the relationship and connection between the teacher and the student, which is associated with conveying the concept to the student, first begins after that, when the teacher sits in awe and begins the lesson as the conclusion of what Rabbah did. After he told them a humorous remark, that's when they sat in awe, because the awe and the sitting in awe is part of the lesson process itself. Understanding this concept, the Rebbe is going to say again, parenthetically, based on this concept of the humorous part is not part of it. It's an introduction, but a necessary introduction to create a channel, to create a rapport, to create a communication. Well, also the Rebbe is going to apply it concerning something else. Number 5. According to this explanation, we can also understand the order reflected in Baruch Chachamim's statement. The left should always be the hand that pushes away and the right that draws near. From the order of their wording, it is apparent that always the initial step must be the left hand that pushes away. Afterwards comes the right hand that draws near. Note that this teaching is emphasizing that the main point is that one must push away only with the left, meaning the weaker hand, and draw close with the right, stronger hand. But the main focus that the Rebbe is going to address over here is, why are you starting off with the left? However, this teaching raises a question similar to the matter discussed previously. How does the order mentioned fit the description of Rabbah's pattern? Rabbah himself, what did he do? He started with a humorous remark, that before beginning his instruction, he would make a humorous remark, meaning an act that drew the students close. And only afterwards he was sitting in awe, reflecting the opposite approach. So you have seemingly a contradiction between these two Mamorei Chazal. The Rabbah first had a humorous approach, then they sat in awe, whereas this other Mamorei Chazal says always a person should push away with the left and bring close with the right. Furthermore, there's a general principle in Jewish law that the right hand deserves precedence over the left. Here, by contrast, the left hand comes before the right. The question is intensified by considering its context. After the statement, the left should always be the hand that pushes away, and the right hand, the one that draws near, the Gemara continues, the Talmud continues, regarding the natural inclination and a child and a woman, the left should push away and the right hand should draw near. Now, the manner in which a child is encouraged to study is by giving him items that he cherishes because of his tender years. He should be told, read, and I will give you walnuts, as the Rambam describes in his commentary in the Mishnah. So from this it's understood that a child, the right hand that draws close, must precede the left hand that pushes away. This can be seen in actual fact. If one first comes to a child with the approach of the left hand that pushes away, it can repel him from studying entirely. However, from the explanation in section 4, we can understand how to resolve this matter, the contradiction between what it says, always the left hand should push away and the right draw near, versus the idea that the Rabbah was the one that began with a humorous remark. The teaching, the left should always speaks only about the order which one should employ when actually working with another person to bring about change within. There, the order must be that first the left hand pushes away, and afterwards the right hand draws close, as stated in sections 3 and 4, that you must always begin a process of change. Any process of change must begin with the bittul of the person. Once there's the bittul of the person, then you could have that they are able to receive the constricted idea, the limited idea, and then you can receive the full idea the way the Rav understands it. However, this teaching is not speaking about the action of the right hand that draws close, because that comes as a necessary preparation and introduction before one conveys the teaching. The initial effort resembles making a humorous remark to open the student's heart, or encouraging an immature student with items that he cherishes, which comes even before the action of the left hand. So when a child needs to be given tasty things before we begin, or when Rabbah had to speak matters of a humorous remark, this is all talking about prior to the actual communication of the topic. This is talking about making the person interested, creating a rapport that is done with the right and not the left first. So now, going back to our topic, the topic of the three names, he's going to use the three types of levels in a person's student and Rav relationship, to apply it concerning our transformation that took place when we went out of Mitzrayim and the receiving of the Torah. Section 6, just as the three motifs are necessary when learning a new concept, as explained in Section 3, similarly, and even more so, do they apply when it comes to altering a person's existence entirely, to the extent that he becomes a new being. We said before that the Jewish people didn't just attain nationhood by going out of Mitzrayim. They became a Torah nation, a completely new type of entity. In the same way, regarding the matter under discussion, the birth of Jews as a people, which culminated and was consummated by them serving Hashem on this mountain, as explained in Section 2, is connected with these three motifs. In order for the Jews to receive the Torah, they had to serve, meaning labor and toil to nullify their previous form and characteristics, which ran contrary to the Torah. Furthermore, like we said, they were immersed in the 49 gates of impurity. Furthermore, their service had to be carried out in the mode of a servant's service, a term rooted in the word tavdun. It says tavdun es elokim alohar hazeh, which has to do with the word eved, in the meaning servant, meaning one who performs his work with bittul, accepting the yoke of his master. This is necessary for the reason that we said before, that when you become the student, first step is bittul. Because in order to receive the Torah, one must make a commitment that mirrors the pledge that the Yidden made at Har Sinai. We will nasa v'nishma, we will do, we will listen. With the promise, we will do nasa, coming before we will listen, before nishma, because there has to be that ultimate bittul to allow them to be able to receive something that's completely beyond them. That is stage 1. B, conversely, the Jews did not carry out their service of God, their avodas Hashem, in a manner that broke their being. Rather, this very service was an expression of the essence of who they were. To refer to a ruling of Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, fish in the sea do not intervene, are not choitzitzim in the lashon of the Gemara, between the water and a person or object that touches them. If a person uses the sea as a mikveh and immerses in the sea, if they get, somehow a fish is blocking water from touching a certain part of their body, it's not considered a chtzitza, because they are not considered a separate entity. In other words, the fish are considered as one with the water itself. So just like the fish in the sea are not considered a separate entity from the water, similarly the Yidden and Torah, the Jews and Torah, are like fish in the sea. In a similar vein, we can understand our Chacham's statement there, Ein lecha ben chodim ela mish oisk b'Torah, there's no free man except one who occupies himself with Torah study. This is difficult to understand. On the surface, Torah requires avodah, service, accepting the yoke of avodah, and avdus to Hashem. However, accepting this yoke enables a Jew to be free. How can that be? Since the true nature of a Jew, as he was created, is to carry out the Torah's mitzvahs, as the Mishnah teaches, I was created to serve my Creator. Therefore, when a Jew does not carry out the Torah's mitzvahs, it may appear to him that he is free without a yoke, and this is so much easier for him. Nevertheless, since living a life that is not in accord with Torah is the opposite of his true being and nature, it is back-breaking labor, what's called the Mitzrayim avodas perech. What's the association with avodas perech? This term is used in line with our Chachamim's teaching that the avodas perech, the back-breaking labor, which the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, imposed on our ancestors, involved the men performing the tasks of women and the women performing the tasks of men. Although it is seemingly easier for a man to perform the tasks of a woman, a man will consider that as avodas perech because it runs contrary to his habit and nature. It is specifically through the work and servitude of Torah that a Jew becomes truly free, because it is through such service that he expresses his genuine self, similar to the fact that in Mitzrayim, it's only the true service of using the particular capabilities that was meant for you that you are considered a free person. As long as you're doing something that's not what you're about, it's called avodas perech. So that is stage number 2, the idea of receiving and identifying and connecting with the Torah, that it becomes something that you see as your liberation. It makes you free, it makes you who you really are. The third level, C, the giving of the Torah, Matan Torah, brought about a radical and distinctive change in the Jewish people. The extent of this change is such that even though the Jews' avodah on the surface involves limited and measured actions according to the boundaries of his existence, he's a limited being, and when he serves Hashem, he serves with his limitations. Yet, the inner dimension of his service is connected with the Noisen HaTorah, the giver of the Torah. As such, it transcends all limits and measures, just like Hashem is beyond all limits and measures. These are the 3 stages. The 3 stages is the idea of the Yid getting out of Egypt, getting out of whatever he was involved in. Next stage is becoming free by connecting with Torah mitzvahs, and the third stage is completely transcending the limitations of the world through Torah. This 3-stage motif is reflected in the 3 names. Chag HaMatzah is Chag Azman Chireseinu, and Chag Pesach. Matzahs represents bittul. It does not rise or inflate. The name Chag HaMatzah indicates that this bittul becomes assimilated within the Jew's being. He is about matzah. That's what he's about. Our freedoms, man cheruseinu or cheruseinu, indicates that the bittul will permeate and become incorporated within his identity to the extent that he perceives that the true conception of freedom is submitting himself to Hashem's will. And this brings him joy, because that is who he is. And otherwise, it's considered back-breaking labor, like we said before. The third name, Pesach, means jump, reflecting the radical leap that took place and had to take place within the Jew's identity, which resulted from the radical leap in the expression of godliness of Elikus from above that occurred during Yetzias Mitzrayim and the giving of the Torah, Matan Torah. The Jews were thus motivated to rise above their limitations and become one with unlimited Elikus godliness, assuming an identity that went far beyond their individual selves. Section 7. One of the lessons that every Jew can derive from the above and apply in his own Avodas Hashem divine service is as follows. The beginning step of Avodas Hashem and its fundamental dimension and root, this is a quote from the Alter Rebbe in Tanya Perek Mem Aleph, is fear of God and the acceptance of Hashem's yoke, serving Him as a servant. However, his avodas Hashem should not be carried out with sadness in a manner that involves breaking oneself, because a Jew's fundamental identity is godly, as it is written, "Your people are all righteous, v'amich kum tzadikim." But we do know that Tanya sometimes does talk about sadness and breaking oneself. But that's like a stage before he begins really getting involved. Sadness and breaking oneself is only necessary when a person has erected barriers and dividers separating him from Hashem. Then he must first break them. Breaking the klippas by breaking his own heart and embittering his soul, like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya. However, the concept of breaking oneself does not exist within holiness in his own right. Bitterness, a broken heart, and a humble spirit are necessary only because of the body and the animal soul during the times when they rule over a person, heaven forbid. Then, the person's broken heart and bitterness of soul, which stem from the attributes of might within holiness, which Alter Rebbe calls gevuras kedoshas, nullify the rule of the body and the animal soul. But it's only like an external issue. It's not the main issue. None of this is inherently relevant to the godly soul. Being broken is not appropriate for it, for the godly soul, only happiness. And the Rebbe is going to demonstrate this with a story with Alter Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek. This also explains the well-known story regarding the Alter Rebbe, who possessed a silver snuff box, tobacco box, that did not have a cover. The Alter Rebbe had removed the polished cover to use as a mirror to adjust his headphones, so that they would be aligned exactly with the place between his eyes that the film was supposed to be. When this story was told in the presence of the Tzemach Tzedek, the one relating it said that the Alter Rebbe broke the cover off the box, the tobacco box. Tzemach Tzedek commented, "My Zaydis, my grandfather's propensity was not to break, neither to break himself nor to break others. He certainly did not break it. It can be assumed that the cover was attached to the tobacco box with a thin rod, and my grandfather removed the rod, and that caused the separation of the lid from the box, but he didn't actually break the box whatsoever." On the surface, one has to wonder why the Tzemach Tzedek could not accept the idea that Alter Rebbe broke off the cover. He would have been doing it for the sake of a mitzvah. It would not have been an act of purposeless destruction. He wouldn't have been transgressing Bal Tashchis. However, this relates to the concept mentioned above. By its very nature, the concept of breaking does not inherently exist within the realm of holiness. Therefore, it was clear to the Tzemach Tzedek that the Alter Rebbe did not break off the cover. For this reason, the bittul and the acceptance of the yoke Kabbalas oil that is demanded as the beginning step of avodas Hashem in the service of the godly soul itself does not leave a person broken, because breaking is not in the world of Kedusha. That first step of the three steps, the idea of the bittul of Chag HaMatzos, is not about breaking the person. On the contrary, it generates pleasure and vitality. How does it bring him to pleasure and vitality? The person realized that this is true freedom. This is his genuine identity as a Jew. Just like that when a student is sitting before his master and he has to totally put aside all his entire mind and completely leave his own intentions behind to be able to receive from the master, that itself accords him joy that he has this great opportunity to receive. It's not something that he feels that it diminishes his self.